Welcome back everyone to step 2 of working with your pinch pots. In our last video, I showed you how you can make pinch pots. I have 2 small ones that would go together to make a smaller form. And then I have 2 larger ones that would go together to make something a little bit larger. Remember, when you're making these, you want to leave that edge a little bit thicker so that when you put them together, you've got a nice space for them to connect. All right, so these pinch pots have been waiting overnight. They're not quite leather hard, but they're kind of in between plastic and leather hard. So I know what that looks like. I can kind of squeeze it a little. The clay still feels sticky. I could pinch it more if I need to, but it definitely has more structure. If it feels like it's just collapsing as you're holding it, then that means you probably want to go back and dry it with the blow dryer or the fan or leave it overnight. Okay, so I'm really scratching up my edges. If you're one of the people who use your needle tool and just do these tiny baby scratches, that is not gonna work here. We really need these 2 forms to come together in a serious way. So we are ripping up the surface. That way our slip will really attach right to it. You might notice instead of a needle tool, I'm using a fork. Anytime you have a lot of seams that you're working on, it's kind of nice to use a fork because it's 4 times as fast. Put a decent amount of slip on there. Now I'm gonna set them together. You might notice that they don't perfectly fit. And so at this point, I'm gonna use my thumbs. I'm holding it, I'm not setting it on the table. Holding it and just kind of pushing those edges together. Just some little pushes, and as I do it, you'll notice that the slip is kind of oozing out. I don't wanna push so hard that the wall implodes. I wanna just kind of push them together. So just kind of slowly giving a little bit of pressure at the seam so it comes together. The decent amount of slip helps me know that it's fusing because I can see it oozing out the sides, and that's important to make sure that it's really well connected. All right, so now I have all this extra slip and the seam is not fully attached yet. So what I'm gonna do is just run my finger around and wipe a little bit of it off. If you don't want to use your finger, you could use your sponge or any other tool. Now it's a little bit more connected. But just like anything, if you're gluing 2 things together, it takes a little bit for that area to dry. And I know you've heard me talk about the Band-Aid coil before. It's just as important here. I'm actually putting a pretty large one on. It's about the size of my pinky. It doesn't have to look like a beautiful coil. This one doesn't even go all the way around. The point though, is that I'm putting it over that seam. I'm not gonna push straight down because that would make that wall implode. Instead, I'm just gonna pull bits of that clay to the side. So I'm basically covering up the seam. I want it to look like it never existed. I'm just gonna slowly turn the piece. I'll turn it this way so you can see a little better. Now, as I'm pulling the clay to the side, you'll notice that the clay, I'm also kind of pushing it along in the seam. So even though it wasn't long enough, it's actually stretching to fill the space. So if I show you where I've already put, you can't really even see that seam anymore. I'm just gonna keep going with that coil until it's all the way around. Because we're gonna be hitting this clay and manipulating it, you really need that seam to be strong. I ran out, so I'm gonna take a little bit more just to finish it off. All right, now before I start to shape it into anything, I'm just gonna double check my seam is covered. Sometimes even if you cover it well, it still can pop open during this next part, and that's normal. You just have to kind of be aware of it. So the next part is starting to shape it. You have to think, do you want this to be a perfect circle? Do you want it to be a long oval? Do you want it to be more rectangular? And the easiest way to shape it is just by hitting it with your hands. You might notice that it's sounding a little different. It sounds like almost like a basketball that's a little deflated. So you can hear that there's air trapped in there. So when I hit it, it's not imploding because the air is pushing back on it. So that's really what we want. If it breaks open at any point, you've got to repair it before you do any more of your paddling. Other ways you can paddle, you can use the table. So if I wanted to make this more square, I can literally just hit it on the table and it's slowly starting to become more of a rectangular shape. All right, the more I do it, the better it gets. It also, by paddling it, it smooths it out. So if you're worried about things like inconsistencies in your clay, just keep going with this process. You don't have to take the time to smooth it. It will automatically kind of get more smooth. So in addition to using your hands, using the table, another technique is actually using a paddle. So paddles are anything that are basically made of wood and something that's softer. So if you're at your home, if you have a big wooden spoon, you could use the back of that wooden spoon to shape it. If you have something that's more flat, you can use that as well. So I like to use these big ones, especially if I'm going to be creating really straight edges on the side. So you can see I'm kind of squaring this off. Let's say I wanted it to be bigger on one side and then kind of taper into a, like think about a raindrop. One thing I can do is actually hold my clay, and when I'm paddling it, I can kind of pull the paddle down. Let me move my slip so I can show you a little better. So I can kind of shape by paddling in a direction. It's pulling the clay basically to lengthen it in that one area. You'll notice as I'm doing this, I'm also holding it. If I set it on the table and paddle it, it's going to just get whatever that edge is from the table underneath it. So you really don't want to do that. You want to hold it. I know it can be a little awkward. This is another good time to note that if it feels too wet, like it feels like it's imploding, it might be something where you want to stop and you want to repair anything. Like for instance, I see this mark is kind of coming out of the area. You also might want to stop and add a little bit of, like give it a little bit more dry time. All right, so I got it a little more tapered. Now I could kind of try to stretch it on the other side into a round shape. I know I'm shaking my camera. If I do it with my hand, maybe it'll be a little less. And you can see I'm starting to form something that's more like a raindrop. Okay, this could also be a good start for a face, right? I have this kind of elongated shape. We've got the skull area up here, the chin area down here. And so I think that's what I'm gonna use this one for in my next video. Those are the basics with a pinch pot. It would be the same thing if I did a smaller one, but just keep in mind that you really wanna attach those two together and make sure it's the right consistency before forming it. Remember, this is a basic building block that you can do almost anything with. I could cut it along the side and use half of it. I could shape it into a square, a circle, really anything you can think of.